The first story we have today is just talking about the upcoming meeting between it's going to be Wendy Sherman and then also the undersecretary of the Russian Foreign Ministry. So Sergei Lavrov's deputy, and they're going to be meeting in Vienna on the 10th. And then there's also a scheduled meeting, I believe it's in Brussels, between a Russian delegation and a NATO delegation, which I'm sure will also include the US, but then other European partners as well. So, if you're listening to this show, you're probably doing it on the 9th or the 10th of January here. And so we're hopefully going to get some news about what's happening at these talks coming out. Initially, I was pretty optimistic about what could come here. The U.S. said the Russian proposal was something they'd be willing to talk about. Putin removed 10,000 troops from the, border region on Christmas. Biden had talked about Blinken, somebody in the State Department, a senior State Department official, had apparently communicated to the Ukrainians they would be unlikely to join NATO for the next 10 years. And so it seemed like we were on the positive path to, having these talks be set up for a diplomatic success. And then this past week happened, and all the rhetoric coming out of all the meetings going on between the U.S. and other NATO officials and meetings between various NATO states was all very suggesting that these talks aren't going to go particularly well. And so first story I have here is from antiwar.com, date to camp on January 7th. U.S. and NATO reject Russia's call for halt of eastward expansion. Dave writes, on Friday, U.S. and NATO rejected a Russian call for the military alliance to halt its eastward expansion amid tensions around Ukraine. Russia submitted a series of security proposals to the U.S., and chief among the Russian requests was the guarantee that Ukraine won't join NATO. I think this is Kyle Anselon's commentary here again. I think that was probably the most important part of the Russian proposal, and maybe I'm misreading Russia a little bit on this, and they're actually more concerned about potential new weapons deployments to Ukraine than Ukraine actually joining NATO itself. But those would likely, I think, be the top two concerns, and probably the ones that Russia is least likely to negotiate on, right? Like talking about the military exercises that Russia doesn't want going on in Eastern European states, removing weapons that are already in place in European states, are probably things that Russia would be, I would hope, willing to negotiate on, because I doubt the U.S. would just reverse its policy in Eastern Europe back to like 2008, and that's kind of what Russia is asking for here, to go back to a little bit of simpler times where you didn't have NATO pushed all the way up to Russia's border, and a plan of action for both Ukraine and the country of Georgia, which is one of the Caucasus countries in the south of Georgia there. I guess between the Caspian and the Black Sea, maybe. Not looking at a map, but that region of the world right there is where Georgia is. And so, these are countries that are countries that are very close to Russian population centers. As Dub Bondow points out, that these aren't even countries that joined Russia as a part of the USSR, but rather as a part of the Russian Empire. These are long-standing Russian countries. These are two countries in 2008 where the U.S. provoked an invasion of the Georgian government of a border area between Georgia and NATO that was under the protection of Russian peacekeepers, because the people in that area when the Soviet Union was falling apart, much like the people of the Donbass region, are, I think, more ethnically Russian and not as interested in being a part of like a Georgian or Ukrainian like government in Kiev, a very Western oriented government. And so in both of those cases, those provoked Russian reactions, where in Ukraine's case in 2014, the Crimean Peninsula was seized. In Georgia, I think 2009, this probably happens at South Ossetia, that is taken back by the Russian state and all of this. And then, of course, Russian peacekeepers remain deployed in Georgia, and then also in the not peacekeepers, but Russia remains supporting of the separatists in the Donbass region of Ukraine. And so these are two pretty clear red lines for Russia, and they're, asking, I think, the U.S. to stop meddling there in particular, and to stop threatening to expand NATO into these countries. And from what we're hearing from the meeting between the secretaries of state and everything of the NATO member countries, they're going to reject that. And so I'm seeing reports today that both sides are not very optimistic about these talks, that Russia is expecting them to be short. And so this doesn't look like a good sign. Now, there are, I guess, a couple other things that I will just float out there that I think are important to note. That sometimes the statements of the government, even to other governments, like the Ukrainian government or the government of Germany or France, that are publicly put out by the US and our NATO allies, might not actually reflect the actual position of Joe Biden on this. And so, this creates a couple possibilities. One is that Antony Blinken, who's the Secretary of State, is kind of out on his own here and pushing the war agenda. Wouldn't be unsurprising. We've seen this plenty of times in administrations, and not just with like Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump, but Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama or something like that. We could go back and look at other secretaries of state that were very hawkish. And so it could really be that, Blinken is out pushing a narrative that isn't necessarily backed by Joe Biden. Joe Biden, for whatever reason, domestic concerns, mental incapabilities, is unable to see what his Secretary of State is doing behind his back, or that they're like hawking it up this week and prior to the actual meetings with Russia, because they're planning on making some concessions. And if you kind of float it beforehand that you're going to make concessions, then the Hots in the United States are going to line up against you. And all this week, they're going to be running op-eds in the Washington Post and the New York Times and USA Today and the Hill and everywhere else about how Joe Biden is giving up on Europe and he's worse than Donald Trump. And I guarantee you that would be the narrative. And so maybe this is a PR move. It's not impossible that that's the case, and that the negotiations are going to signal positions that are far more willing to compromise, or that, in private, the U.S. is going to extend to Russia that, hey, look, we can't actually revoke Ukraine's eventual bid to be a NATO member, but we're going to promise you, not going to put it in writing, not going to leave this room, but the Russian government, Vladimir Putin, can take it to the bank that Joe Biden will absolutely not make Ukraine a NATO member. And while I'm sure that there is a sense that's a positive, right? Like that's a good understanding on the U.S., the Biden administration's part to like make a proposal like that. I'm not sure Russia will be willing to accept it. And there's a few reasons for this. And both, I think, 1990 and then 1997, the U.S. government, separate administrations, made promises to Russia about NATO expansion and various other actions that the U.S. and our Western allies would not take in Eastern Europe, that were not formal agreements, not written down, and those are absolutely shattered by the West and NATO. So it wouldn't necessarily be a surprise if Russia isn't willing to accept that. And that could be a miscalculation on the Biden administration's part, that they think that Russia will and they won't. And then what happens is a question mark and could get ugly, or it could cause the Biden administration to wake up and accept a reality. So, got to talk about this interview with Aaron Mate and Douglas McGregor. McGregor is somebody I've talked about a lot on the show. Scott Horton has talked about him a lot on the show. Somebody that, the anti-war community, and like particular me and Scott, hold in very high regard, was talking to Aaron Mate, saying that, look, an invasion of Ukraine by Russia seems very likely. And he was pointing out that the Biden administration would be unwilling to go far enough to meet the Russian demands, and that this was essentially going to be the reason for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but that he said it as such a matter of fact that this is what's going to happen. Not that, this has to be what happens, that no matter what Biden does, Russia is just going to invade Ukraine, and that's the way the world has to be. But by the politics that he sees being played out here, that this is the way that it's going to go. And I guess, I just say that that's a possibility on this show, I've talked about how I really don't think Russia wants to go that route for various reasons. I don't think it would be a strategic move on like the population of Ukraine and the political balance in general of that country. If the people of the Donbass region are able to vote in national elections in Ukraine, that's going to help to create a more Russian friendly government in Ukraine, because the people of that region are Russian friendly. And so you know, like if you just like made California its own republic or something like that, right? Like that's going to make the Democrat Party less influential in Washington D.C. because a huge portion of their voter base, you know, it's a democracy, quote unquote, whatever, republic, or, you know, however you want to describe it, but basically it's like a chaotic mob versus deep state oligarchic rule that is kind of crazy, where the mom's vote is just driven by the media and everything, and by the deep state. But anyways, on the front that we were talking about before in Ukraine, if, you know, again, Russia were to officially annex the Donbass region, that would, you know, take away a number of votes that would be pro-Russian. Also, you know, I think in a sense it would be like annexing the Rust Belt and, you know, areas of the country that have a lot of problems. Look, like, can you imagine if the Canadians were talking about annexing somewhere in the United States, and they were talking about like taking Wisconsin, including Kenosha, and you know, maybe like not Chicago, but most of Indiana or something like that, and just all these areas that are, you know, aging and economically struggling and dependent regions, right? It's not going to be regions that come problem free. It's going to be regions that come with economic liabilities. And so it's not, I don't think, necessarily Russia's top choice to actually annex Ukraine. I think they would far prefer you know, Russian friendly, or at least a decidedly neutral Ukraine that it, you know, is committed to not allowing in NATO weapons and everything like that. But that doesn't seem to be the course that we're on. I see, you know, even today they're talking about that we have to worry about Ukraine's territorial sovereignty and everything like this. And so very concerning what's going to happen this week. And my guess is by the Wednesday, or at the very least Friday show, I'll have an update on what actually happened during these talks and just how bad the news is. And who knows, maybe it's not that bad.